There's three basic parts of logic: terms, propositions, and arguments. Now, we always begin with terms. We have to come to terms with someone before we can move on properly to determining the truth or falsity of a proposition or the validity of an argument. Now, a term right here in this first proposition, all men are mortal, the terms are men and mortal. Those are the terms. These terms happen to be only one word, but a term can be more than one word. A term can be many words. A term can be hundreds of words. I can make this term right here, men, longer if I were to add an adjective or some relative clause that would modify it. So if I said all men who drink a lot of milk are mortal, all men who drink a lot of milk is a term. It's a bigger term than the one I have right here, which is just men. I can also say all red men, all blue men. I can say all tall men, all short men. I can modify this word with a variety of different words, and that would change the term. The term that it is right now is men, and this term over here is mortal. Now, what do we mean when we say mortal? What we really mean here is mortal things. So all men are mortal things. Now, I can write that, and it would be essentially the same term. But I can also, describe mortal things more and make it a longer term. The important point to know here is that a term can be longer than just one word. In this proposition, this first sentence right here, all men are mortal. Well, let me just tell you, this, what you see right here, this first sentence, this second sentence, and the third sentence is an argument. An argument contains propositions. A proposition is just a sentence. It's a declarative sentence. And propositions contain terms. Okay, so even though logic begins with coming to terms with each other, is making sure that we're on the same terms. Even though logic begins with that, sometimes, they all work together. Even when you're coming to terms with someone, you may have to give an argument of why a term means what it means. And so there's no chronological order with terms, propositions, and arguments in action. But we do make a distinction when we are debating properly or we're arguing properly. We want to make the distinction and deal with terms first. If we're not on the same terms, that's the first thing that needs to be discussed. That's the first thing that needs to be debated or argued. The second part of logic, basic part of logic, is propositions. All men are mortal, right here, is a proposition. It's a declarative sentence. If we were in English class, that would be a declarative sentence. But in logic, it's a proposition. A proposition is some sentence that you are laying down, you're putting forth as either true or false. In fact, that's how you test a proposition to see if it's a proposition. It's if it can be true or false. So if I say all men are mortal, you can either say true or false. You can't do that with every sentence because every sentence doesn't qualify as a proposition. If you were going to give a question, you wouldn't be able to say true or false to a question and it would make sense. Like if you go to a restaurant or something and the waitress comes to the table and she asks you what you want to eat for dinner and you say false, that wouldn't make any sense because a question is neither true or false. Right? Some questions don't really qualify as real questions, but that's besides the point. It's not a proposition. It cannot be true or false. Just like a command. Like if you give a command it cannot be true or false. Like if you tell your child, go over here, get out of the way, or go sit down, and they say false, right? They're not saying that the sentence you told them is false. They're just being sarcastic. They're being smart aleck. They don't want to listen to what you're saying. So only propositions, go over there, go sit over there, are true or false. This right here is a proposition, all men are mortal. Here's another proposition, Socrates is a man. Here's another proposition, therefore Socrates is mortal. So in this argument right here, in fact, this is one of the most famous arguments in logic, what we call a syllogism. In fact, this is called the bullseye syllogism because it has the most common form that human beings argue in. So we have this first proposition, all men are mortal. The second one, Socrates is a man. And then the third one, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's an argument. Okay, so we did terms, propositions, and now the argument. The argument is right here. Here's the first premise, all men are mortal. The second premise is Socrates is a man. And then we have the conclusion, which is therefore Socrates is mortal. Now we know it's the conclusion because it has what's called the conclusion indicator, therefore. Now what are the premises? A premise is just a reason for a conclusion. So when you ask them, when somebody tells you something that they want you to believe something, or they're laying down a conclusion, and you ask, why do you believe that? They're going to give you the reasons. They're going to give you the premises. So that's what a premise is. A premise is just a proposition, but it's acting as a reason for a conclusion. So all men are mortal is a premise. So what is it? It's a proposition first, and it's also a premise. It's a premise because it's a reason for this conclusion in this argument. What's the other premise? Socrates is a man. So this argument right here has two premises. Has two premises and one conclusion. And so the premises, like I said previously, are the reasons for the conclusions. So you infer the conclusion from the premises. And so these are the three basic parts of logic: terms, propositions, and arguments. And this is, if we want to say, the order that you should be thinking about this stuff. Although, like I said previously, when you are arguing or reading arguments, all of these things are happening at the same time. Propositions, terms, they're all intertwined. In other words, we give arguments in order to define terms, and those arguments have propositions. But in the order of understanding arguments and being clear and coming to an agreement on something, or just understanding if we want, if an argument is worthy of our, or if a conclusion is worthy of our belief, we start with the terms. We see if the terms, if we agree on terms, and then we find out if the propositions are true, and then we look at the argument to see if the conclusion follows from the premises.